Just very briefly, the legislation, and again, I won't focus on it too much because parts of it are likely to change. But these are things which are in both pieces of legislation. Every company in the business will have to have hazard analysis, implementation of preventive controls, and a written food safety plan. FDA will have expanded records access authority. Would you like to comment on that?
FDA's Records Access Authority was originally put into the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, and we were successful in saying that the agency first had to have a reasonable suspicion that something bad was happening before they could ask you for their records. It couldn't just be a Tuesday afternoon and they were bored and they could come knock on your door. But these bills would allow them to have access anytime.
More extensive access?
No. Same exemptions apply.
Just quicker?
Just any time, no reason.
Anytime. But you have to be in a position to provide those records very quickly. And I think in terms of IT departments, the burden is going to fall on you to provide that and to provide it quickly, because the man upstairs is going to call, or the woman upstairs is going to call down and say, hey, we got to provide this to FDA quickly. So there are going to be impacts throughout the system, throughout the company, as we move forward with legislation. Developing traceback capability, another one which is going to fall, I believe, heavily upon IT departments in the various different food companies. In the House bill, you have to be able to trace back to the origin of contamination within 2 days. Risk-based inspections, which everybody agrees on, and increased FDA surveillance activity and capacity. Next, please. Expanded FDA enforcement authority. Under the Bioterrorism Act, everybody has to register, not retailers, but everybody else in the system has to register. So they will be able to suspend the registrations, which means you can't produce food anymore. Issue cease distribution orders and mandated recalls. And then authorizes the FDA to collect fees if you have to be re-inspected or if there is a recall out there that to go back in.
What happened in March of 2010, as John mentioned, the Senate was very involved in healthcare legislation. One provision of healthcare legislation is Section 4205, and that's become familiarly, easy for me to say, known as the menu labeling requirements. And basically, that means, and it applies specifically to chain restaurants and similar retail food establishments, and each of those things have definitions associated with them. But basically, if you fall into one of those two categories, you're going to have to provide additional nutrition information. Other thing to keep your eye on is that vending machines are also covered. So if you're an owner or operator of 20 or more vending machines, this will apply to you as well. There are two pieces of the regulatory process. As John says, I beg to differ. The regulatory process is not cleaner than the legislative. Well, I'll say this.
It has a time frame.
Oh,
the comments are 30, 60, 90 days.
Yes, there is a comment period.
The Senate has no time frame on what it does.
True, okay. But then there's not, unless Congress imposes a hammer, those proposed rules can hang out there for decades. There are proposed rules at FDA that have been there for literally decades. Okay, so Congress passed it. Goes to FDA to say, okay, so what does this stuff mean? Who has to do what? The agency is working on regulations, and they're working on a guidance document. I think one of the things that was most surprising to everybody is that although this law has a provision in it that says FDA thou shalt write regulations, which means they go through a proposed rule, a comment period, a final rule in its simplest form. And FDA started that process. They put out a notice in July of this year and said, tell us what you think about the statute, tell us how you think we should write the regulations and what they should say. So much to everybody's surprise, a month later the agency came out with a guidance document and said, oh, guess what, we forgot to tell you, but all of the 75% of this law actually took effect last March. So all of you people who haven't been doing anything on menu labeling, technically, FDA would say that you're out of compliance, and you actually had the obligation to start doing that last March. When they came out with their draft guidance in August, they also said we're not going to enforce against it until we get a final guidance document, which they expect to do in December, and then they'll tell you how much time you have to implement. So, I know I'm fascinating, and so you got lost in what I was saying.
Let me just add one thing there. When it's the Restaurant Association, particularly the Chain Restaurant Association, that wanted this law. in place. They were being hit by laws being passed at the state level and at the municipality level. So they didn't want to have to comply with maybe 100 different laws out there. So they were going to go to Congress and say, give us one law and we'll comply. They came to FMI and asked if we would support them. And I said, are supermarkets included? They said, yeah. No, we won't support you unless you drop supermarkets. They dropped supermarkets. Somehow after I left FMI, supermarkets got back in this piece of legislation. And therefore, when we took a look at it, those words about, what are the exact words?
Similar retail food establishments.
Similar retail food establishments. You're covered. So this is something that new that you're going to have to deal with.
In terms of grinding logs, the agency hasn't yet issued a proposed rule. So we don't know exactly where they're going to go with this, but I saw an early draft of it. And what they could ask for, and what was in this draft, is that they would be asking you basically to put lot tracking information on each package of ground beef. So think about that, right? In the back of the store, you've got a guy who's carving up primals and he's put some bench trim aside. And at the end of all his primals, he's going to take that bench trim out, he's going to grind it, and then put it in the ground beef packages. How are you going to figure out which piece of which primal was ground and then put into a package? Yeah. So that's the challenge in that one. Yeah.
Not only that, you then have to have your front end be able to scan that barcode symbology to hold that, as well as have your scales be able to print labels that have that information on there.
The point, in case you couldn't hear that, is that you're also going to have to be able to retain that information. It's going to have to be able to be held at scales, and that's the whole point. Exactly, their grinding logs, their records. The agency is going to want that information.